Hello, welcome back to my channel, a place where you can let go of your stress while listening to stories found on the internet, or not. You can call me DW, for those who didn't know. So just grab your favorite drink, sit back, and relax. Well now, let's start by turning down the background music, shall we? This is part 6 of a 7-part story, so I know I say this a lot, but if you haven't finished the previous parts, it is highly recommended to do so before you continue. There's a link in the description. So, let's start the story. Part 6. The Ritual. The sun was all but set. The air grew colder, and I, standing in the dark, was in front of a large black rectangle of emptiness. I wiped a bit of sweat from my upper lip, digging. Even in the cool temperature of the basement was hard work. Dr. Reid let her shovel fall in the dirt next to her. I set mine down as well. "What now?" she asked Frank. "Thank you, Dr. Reid, Samuel," Frank said with a smile. He then turned slightly to Rufus, who was still looming over his wheelchair. "The other supplies now, Rufus, if you could." Rufus stooped over the pile of items he had retrieved earlier: the metal rod, the mysterious jug, and the black plastic bag. He went for the jug first, lifting it carefully and walking towards the fresh hole we had just dug. He unscrewed the cap, then slowly tilted it forwards. A thick, dark liquid slowly began to trickle out, and for a moment I thought, or rather hoped, that it was ink. A while earlier, we had passed an antique printing press inexplicably shoved against one of the walls. Perhaps the jug was a remnant of whoever had once used the basement as a print shop. "What is that?" I asked, looking to Rufus as I heard the sound of liquid hitting the bottom of the pit. But it was Frank who answered. "Sheep's blood," Frank said pleasantly, and I blinked for a moment, startled, as if it had suddenly decided to start paying attention. My nose picked up a distinctly rusty smell in the dank air, one that was familiar, but turned my stomach all the same. Dr. Reid vocalized precisely what I had been wondering myself. "Why?" "Like I said," Frank replied vaguely, "this process, strange as it seems, is an ancient science. Best not to rush it." Dr. Reid showed a face of concern, a well-reasoned one in my opinion. One person who had fallen unusually silent, however, was Sasha. I could see in the dim light that he was watching the dark liquid drizzle out into the pit with confusion, but it was less of the frightened expression I had become accustomed to seeing on his face, and more one of curious bewilderment. "And now, the bag," Frank continued, as the trickle of blood ebbed, and Rufus moved away from the pit. With a crinkle of plastic, he lifted the bag, and my heart rate elevated as he reached into it and began to pull out its content. With relief and a little bit of morbid disappointment, I saw that it wasn't a corpse or body parts that weighed down the bag. It was a jar. It was full of an off-white liquid that sloshed around as Rufus removed it from the bag and unscrewed the lid with a pop. He then poured it into the old one, this liquid falling much faster than the blood had. "And that?" Dr. Reid asked, looking at the jar as Rufus emptied it and replaced the cap. But before Frank could answer, someone else did. "Milk and honey," Sasha said with a short disbelieving chuckle. Dr. Reid and I looked at Sasha quizzically, but Frank only smiled in the darkness. "And a bit of white barley," he added. "I was beginning to wonder when you'd figure this out, Dr. Bazarov." "Of course," Sasha replied, shaking his head with an odd small smile. "Straight out of the Odyssey. Sheep's blood, dirt, milk, honey, barley." Circe tells Odysseus the same recipe when he's trying to communicate with Tiresias in Hades. Rufus had picked up the long metal rod and stuck it into the pit. Then he began to stir. "You really think that'll work?" I had little to no idea of what Sasha was talking about, but it was evident that Frank did. He laughed out loud, jovially. "I know it will." The sound coming from the pit was wet and thick, as Rufus stirred the rod around and around, with visible effort. Then Rufus removed the rod. I could see the bottom end of it was wet and dark from the mixture. He put it on the ground. "Now, Rufus, as we discussed." With that, the tall figure moved over to the old man, braced him with his long arms, as Frank began to stand with Rufus' assistance. "Is this really a good idea?" Dr. Reid asked, and I was surprised that she seemed concerned with Frank's well-being. Though he was an old man, I was more worried about his pit of blood and milk than whether or not he threw out his back. Frank, breathing heavily, waved one of his arms at her, slightly frustrated. Shakily, he made it to his feet. The telephone he had been clutching left behind in the seat. But he didn't stop there. Rufus led him to the ground, on his knees in front of the pit. Then, with one arm being firmly grasped by Rufus behind him, Frank leaned forwards and dipped his hand down into the pit. "Move off from the pit and take away your sword," he muttered to himself, "so I may drink the blood and speak truth to you," Sasha continued, as Frank's hand rose from the pit, full of the black, thick mixture. He looked at it for only a moment before bringing it to his mouth and swallowing its contents. He shuddered a bit as he did it, but didn't appear altogether fazed at having just drunk sheep's blood and dirt. He leaned back slightly, onto his knees away from the pit, and Rufus let go of his arm. It was silent. All four of us in the basement watched Frank, mouth blackened as his hand, close his eyes, and sit on the dirt floor. "What's happening?" Dr. Reid asked eventually, looking to Frank. When the old man kept his eyes closed, she looked to Sasha. "What's happening?" she asked again. Sasha, calmer than I had seen him throughout this entire ordeal, gave a heavy sigh. "I believe he thinks drinking this mixture will allow a spirit to speak through him. Though, even in the Odyssey, it didn't give powers of possession of spirits to spirits, just merely gave them the ability to form coherent..." Sasha was interrupted from his explanation by Rufus, who had raised his hand up to his face, long pointer finger on his thin lips, and shushed him. He then turned his attention back to Frank. After a pause, Sasha continued, whispering, "It's not going to work, of course. It's just a bit of Greek superstition." Again, Sasha was interrupted, this time by a more forceful shh from Rufus. I turned my attention back over to the pit and was startled to see that Frank had opened his eyes. There was a moment, I will admit, where I wondered if something had actually happened, something supernatural. But when Frank spoke, he was still Frank. "It hasn't worked," he said simply, still on his knees in the dirt. "Why hasn't it worked?" He turned to look at Rufus, who offered no explanation, just the same stoic stare that he always gave. I followed his instructions to the letter. "I don't understand." Gingerly, Sasha tried to reason with Frank. "Sir, it's just a story. There's no science to this ritual at all. It's just—" "You don't understand," Frank interrupted, growing visibly frustrated. He told me this was how to do it. This was how he could be here with us. This is how he would tell me what I needed to know." It was at this point I began to feel some pity for Frank once again. Despite being led into a disturbing home, and then into an increasingly disturbing basement, the man had given me little reason to believe he had malicious intention. Besides the face that he had been accused of murdering his wife and child, but I was fairly certain he was innocent of all that as well. Sure, he was eccentric, but tragedy does that to you. Frank was rambling now, still kneeling next to the pit. The more I looked at Frank McKinley on the ground in the dark, the sadder I felt for him, and the less frightened I felt. That is, until Frank's rambling was interrupted by an eerily familiar shrill sound. The old telephone, unplugged as I believe it to be, was ringing in the seat of Frank's wheelchair. Next time, more blood, more darkness, and more questions. Now, that's the end of part 6. Well, what do you think? Is the story good? Let me know in the comment section down below, and please subscribe if you haven't yet. We'll see you again next time. Sweet dreams.